more. Welcome to Guns and Ammo's Buzz podcast. Our guest today is Mr. Hamilton Bowen. He's the founder of Bowen Classic Arms, which is a custom gun making shop in Tennessee. He focuses on high quality custom revolvers. He's a member of the American Custom Gunmakers Guild, American Pistolsmith Guild. He's an author. He's an attorney. In my opinion, he's one of the most talented gun makers out there working today. He's taken the craft of building revolvers to a level that honestly didn't exist before. Combines really high performance with what I feel like is exquisite style. And when I started reading Guns and Ammos in the late 80s, early 90s, his guns really help ignite my passion for custom gun making. So I thought it'd be appropriate for him to be my first guest. Hamilton, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Well, my pleasure.
So you and I've spoken before, but and honestly, one of those conversations is what led to this podcast being established, because I thought, gee, this is some gold mine of 45 minutes of information that I had to cut into 2 or 3 little quotes. And if readers could go get kind of the rest of the story, it'd be great for a lot of them. So that's one of the reasons we're doing this. Tell me about your path into the trade. How did you go from a little kid who was into guns to a professional gun maker?
Well, that's a terrible story. I'm sure I should have a good canned answer for that. I really don't, but like most kids born in the boomer generation in the early 50s and late 50s and 60s, when I grew up, we all saw guns all the time on television, cops and robber stuff. So I grew up fascinated by them, almost inescapable. Kids now have video games and this sort of thing to play with, but we had cap guns and cowboy guns and that kind of thing. So I grew up around guns, and I'm not sure when it really occurred to me that these guns had to come from somewhere. But eventually, I suppose in my teens, I finally figured out, hey, you could actually go out there and make guns for a living. And it kind of went from there. My parents were relatively bright, educated people and insisted that nevertheless I get a formal education. So I went to undergraduate school and studied history and English, and eventually went to law school just in case the gun trade didn't work out. Mercifully, it did, so I didn't have to leave the home, so to speak, and go to work in the real world.
And you ended up spending some time at Trinidad State in gunsmithing school, right?
Yes, I spent a year and a half there, and with the out-of-state tuition, what it was, and the school was overwhelmed with students at the time, so there wasn't a lot of machine time available. So I thought, well, rather than spend the money on tuition, I'd just go home and buy the equipment, put it in the basement of the old home place, and get to work. So I didn't actually graduate, but I went there, like I said, a year and a half.
So a lot really self-taught in a lot of ways.
Oh, almost exclusively. We learned the rudiments in these schools. They're fantastic places to learn just basic machine work and learn a little bit about simple things like head spacing and all the other gun mechanics that would be necessary to do anything in the trade. And they had a nice stock making program and all this sort of thing, but like I said, the schools were just overwhelmed with students. So it was sometimes harder to learn there than it would be out on your own. There's no substitute for getting a machine, learning how to set it up and run it on your own.
And very little focus in those days, from my understanding, in the school on revolvers, correct?
Almost none. I was sort of a duck out of water. There were a couple of other guys that had an interest in revolvers, and there was a lot of interest in 1911s in those days. But like I said, there was very little. There were no formal classes in revolver theory and technology and that kind of stuff that might appear in some of the more contemporary school curricula. And
your passion for revolvers came from a very practical place of not wanting to lose your brass as a young handler.
Absolutely. I'm descended from Clan McCheap, so I don't waste or lose anything if I can help it. And the few autoloaders I owned were just, I was losing 50% of my brass, and I will reload a case until it's utterly unserviceable. But the other thing is, around the old home place, and we live on a farm here in East Tennessee. It's not an active farm, but I had all kinds of opportunities to shoot and hunt small game and that kind of thing. And autoloaders didn't really fill the bill for that.
Right. So you get started, you're kind of teaching yourself, and I do a bit of that myself, and I know I'm not to the point that I'm happy with my work. How long did it take you to where you felt like you really were turning out quality work?
Well, I put in my 10,000 hours like everybody else did. And in retrospect, I wish that I had been able to put in those 10,000 hours before I actually went into the trade. But somehow you've got to make a living and keep yourself afloat. So I started in about 1985, I think, in the serious revolver work. But by the time the 1990s, middle 1990s rolled around, we had essentially established all the basic technology we needed. Now, we've certainly made improvements over the years to that, but it took several years and probably a couple dozen guns before I was really fluent in what I was doing.
And I know you didn't have a lot of sort of hands-on mentors, but I'm sure you had influences, folks that inspired you style-wise. Who were they?
Well, the style stuff came mostly from my friends in the Gunmakers Guild and the old English guns that I happen to like. I'm a great fan of Alexander Henry and Daniel Fraser, but a lot of the stylistic touches that ended up on the revolvers that came from the revolver world probably came from people like King and some of the pre-war guys like Croft and Sedgley and some of those folks. They probably had the greatest influence. But after that, it was just us trying to find new ways to expand the revolver horizon, so to speak. And a lot of the stuff that we do now is incorporating rifle style work into it, barrel profiles like ovate form barrels and that kind of thing. That strictly came out of the rifle world.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in your work. You go through photos, and I highly
Yes.
recommend that people go on your website, which is bowenclassicarms.com, and it's one of those websites where you can just spend hours looking at photos and reading, and it's just you're a great writer. The photos are fantastic, and there's so much of this, you know, English long gun style in your revolvers that it's just really neat. As someone who's a fan of those guns and a fan of revolvers, to have found somebody that put those two things together is great. Um, I assume you mentioned Croft and Sedgley. I'm assuming the Keith number 5 was a big influence for you.
Oh, absolutely. It's driven a lot of our work. I'm not necessarily obsessed with it as far as a using gun. There are things about the grip frame that don't fit my hands, but Elmer was about 5'6", and I'm about 6'5", so there are probably physical differences that may have driven that
Right.
part of the show.
And you got your hands on that gun at one point.
Yes, I've actually had it in hand and made a couple of minor repairs to it. It still survives in pretty good shape. The finish is in wonderful shape, but it's showing a little mechanical wear and tear along the way.
How did it compare? I know, and it's we'll get to your book, but on the cover of your book is a very faithful reproduction that you built. How close did you come when you actually got your hands on the?
Well, surprisingly close. There are obviously little details here and there that we missed, but the thing I missed the worst, or the biggest failure here, was that I didn't realize or understand exactly how the rear sight was made on the original because I never saw it and I never got pictures that were good enough. And I assumed that the sight on the gun was a one-piece sight that was drift adjustable for windage. What I couldn't see was the lock screw that retained it from the rear of the top strap. And it turned out that it was nothing more than a custom base that used pre-war Smith & Wesson adjustable sight blades. So we made just a one-piece sight instead of a 2 or 3-piece sight. So we had a way of, we put a pin vertically through the dovetail, in the middle of the dovetail, just up through the frame, and had 2 screws that moved the whole sight back and forth rather than just 2 little screws that moved just the blade with a fixed body. So that was probably the biggest obvious miss. But from 3 feet away, if you hadn't seen the original, you wouldn't know.
Right, right. And now we take for granted now you can go on to Rock On Auction's website and see all these gorgeous detailed photos of that gun. But
Yes.
You were going off of books, probably photos from Keith books and snippets here and there.
Well, absolutely. We had some very primitive Brownie camera snapshots of the gun made by an engraver named Dan Love, who's happily still alive. But he and Elmer Keith were pals, so he got to look at the gun and handle it in detail, which was immeasurably valuable to us. We had no other reference to that gun except some murky pictures in some of Keith's books.
Well, you just about nailed it from what little information you had. That's a
Well,
feat
we were
itself.
close, and I was tickled at how it came out. I would not have guessed we would have come that close to it, but we knew pretty much from the written descriptions of what it was supposed to look like, and we just by hook or by crook got there.
Well, getting away from that gun, I mean, a lot of your guns over the years, both single actions and double actions have been built on Rugers. Was there a practical reason, or how did you?
Oh, very much so. First place, they were cheap and they were available, and the parts were tougher than damn it. So they were a hand, for instance, in a Ruger's a $3 or $4 part. In a Colt now, it's a $30 or $40 part. So I could afford to tear up and chew up and screw up a lot of Ruger parts before I perfected the ratchet systems, for instance, on the cylinders. So not only were the guns very, very hardy, they were very simple and easy to work on. Plus, Ruger had a great service department, and we could get anything we needed to work on them. And that was half the battle right there.
Yeah, and dimensionally, like I said, just bigger, tougher. Some of the really high power stuff you've done over the years would probably turn a Colt into confetti.
Oh, one shot from a load in a high pressure 45 Colt would disassemble a Colt completely. It would kill the gun and the shooter both, probably.
Right. You did, correct me if I'm wrong, you did some Ruger rifle projects years ago?
A few. Back when my friend Cliff LeBounty was still reboring actively, we built several number ones and 470 and 500 nitro. The guns were a little bit light. I'll admit weren't great fun to shoot, but it's, again, what we had at the time. We did maybe 2 or 3 505 Gibbs on the 77 Safari gun or whatever Ruger called it at the time.
Right.
But we just were spread a little bit too thin to keep up the rifle work. So we did a few of those, 2 or 3 years, and just got out of it.
Okay. I remember seeing the ads, and that was, there's an information gap between the, guys like Elmer who wrote books, and now things are on the internet, but there's a, 3 decade or so gap where if you don't have the old print magazine, it doesn't exist. And I recall seeing those ads, but I've never seen a gun in the flesh. So that was one of the things I've always wanted to ask you about. Getting into guns and ammo, and you and I talked about this when we spoke previously. Your career began far before the internet was a reality. So getting the word out there was a tough thing. And as a sole proprietor, probably buying advertisement was not really in the cards. So getting in a gun magazine was a big deal in those days. And I guess Ross was probably one of the guys that led me to know about you and saw those guns on the pages of Guns and Ammo. The first one I remember distinctly was the Minute of Angle revolver. Where for those that don't remember the article, Ross Seifried took a 45 Colt and a relatively compact, maybe a 5.5 inch barreled gun.
I think so. It wasn't very long, as I remember.
And was shooting 5-shot inch groups at 100 yards with a pretty rudimentary scope mount, and just an amazing feat of craftsmanship and frankly marksmanship. What was building that gun like?
Well, it was no different than anything else we did. I don't know that we went out of our way one way or the other. The technology for line boring by then was pretty well perfected here, at least in our shop. And that was, I think, the secret to it. That and maybe not over torquing the barrel and getting a choke in the back end of the barrel. But beyond that, it was mostly Ross. It takes a phenomenally good hand to do that. I couldn't probably shoot an inch group with a scope revolver at 50 yards or 25 yards now.
Right.
But that was mostly a credit to his marksmanship rather than the gun itself.
Yeah, Rob Latham, who's known as the Great One of the most accomplished competitive shooters of all time, has said that Ross is the greatest pistol shooter who's ever lived. And I think that article was pretty good evidence that might be the case.
But fair call, I would say.
Yeah. So let's talk about line boring. Alignment on a revolver is a very important thing, and there's a lot of moving parts, and you've got 5 or 6 cylinders that you're trying to get to line up with a forcing cone. Tell us kind of how the line boring solves.
Well, it's not that complicated, really, and there are probably 100 ways to do this. We devised a way early on that's worked well for us. The first thing we do is we have 2 base pin reamers that align the base pin holes. If you gauge a Ruger single action revolver, the front base pin hole and the back base pin hole are not always coaxial or collinear. They go off at odd angles. So sometimes you can't put a base pin that fits tightly to the front won't even engage the back hole. So we have a pair of reamers that engage each hole at a time, at the same time, and then true up the axes and get them as coaxial as we can do them with simple hand tools. And once that's done and in place, then we can put an oversized base pin in the frame. And the other trick beyond that is simply blocking up the bolt or the cylinder stop so that the cylinder doesn't move when it's in battery, so to speak. So we have a very tightly fitted bolt nose with undersized notches on the cylinder body. And then there's what we call a bearing block. If you look at one of our line board guns, there's 3 pinholes or screw holes on the left side of the receiver. Ruger, 2 of those are Ruger's hammer and trigger pivots. The third one is the screw head that holds the bearing block in place. And with the bearing block in place, we can isolate the movement of the bolt. And if the bolt nose is fitted to the cylinder and it doesn't move on its axis on the base pin, then we have a pretty tightly locked up gun.
And then you fixture that cylinder right and indicate where each of the cylinder holes are going to be.
The next part of the job would be, like you said, we have a very precisely ground and threaded gauge, if you will, that screws into the face of the receiver. The cylinder is used to hold the receiver. There's not a lot of stress on the receiver. It just has to be tight enough relative to the cylinder so that the receiver doesn't float around. Then we indicate to find the center of the threads on the receiver and then bore down through the receiver ring into the cylinder. And that gets us about as perfectly gauged as we can get. Beyond that, the only other trick is we have to make sure we turn the barrels as concentrically on their threads as possible. But the other thing is I should also mention that when this cylinder is in this vertical V-block fixture on the milling machine, or in our case, a jig boring machine, we also face the top of the receiver so that the receiver face is as square as we can get it to the threads. If you tighten up barrels on some guns, it's not just Rugers or Smith, I mean, it'll happen to any of them. If the receiver face is a little bit out of square with the cylinder axis or the base pin, for instance, it may touch at the top or bottom or one of the sides before it comes out flat onto the receiver. So we don't want to have to crush the barrel on there and have it wobble off axis a little bit because of the receiver face. So we true that up as well.
And the end result is you're starting that bullet out very directly into the rifling without it bouncing its way in there.
As far as we're able to. We don't have to have great big forcing cones. We've got to make sure that that bullet doesn't have a chance to tip sideways in a big, long forcing cone, which would be necessary in a sloppily aligned gun. But the smaller the forcing cone, the less loss of directional support we have. And also, we don't go blowing a lot of lube out. The bigger the forcing cone, the more loss of bullet lubricant you're going to realize as it passes over the barrel gap. So we hope to cut down that a lot as well.
What I love about your guns is you got that dedication to the technical aspects to make the gun shoot well, but then there are on some of your stuff just really, really, really exquisite style. And I think maybe the best example of that is the number 13 that you built. It was also a guns and ammo gun.
Yes.
And that folks can find the article on your website. Tell us about that gun.
Well, that was Ross's brainchild. The work we did was probably the simplest part of it. We obviously had to. I'm not a great welder, so I generally farm out my welding to superior welders, which doesn't take much. There are plenty of good ones out there, and they welded up the back end of the receiver so we could put a little express sight in it. But the other part of the building was pretty straightforward. The cylinder was done just as we usually line bore them. The only exception, the only other difficult part for me anyway, was we had to come up with some good solid technology to sleeve a barrel. We wanted a Damascus barrel on it, so we got a forging. Ross found a forging some knife maker had made for the purpose, and we bored out the forging and put a liner in it that we thought was hardy enough to be shot by itself without the support of the outer sleeve. Got that put together, and after that it was a pretty straightforward building project. I think the only other thing, as I remember, that was a little different, we applied a rifle style front sight base. I don't remember exactly where we got it, but it was rigged up. It may have been an adjustable front sight for elevation because the rear sights were essentially fixed. But beyond that, it was a relatively straightforward building project. The real stars of the show are Jim Nixon, who did the engraving, and then Mary Mueller, who did those unbelievable grips. They're still the most amazing set of pieces of scrimshaw work I've ever seen.
I've had my hands on that revolver.
Have
you? It's a beautiful gun, and it's, I believe, the only gun in his vault that's physically protected. He's got plastic wrapped around those grips to protect that scrimshaw.
Given what else is in his vault, that seems superfluous, but we're grateful.
Right. That's the most that well, yeah. There's some special things in there, but that's just a gorgeous gun. It was one of those articles I've never forgotten. I'm sure I have that issue somewhere. As when I moved away from home, my mom made me cull through my stacks of gun magazines, and I went through and kept those that I wanted to keep forever and have them somewhere. So my guns of yours, the first is the Nimrod, which is I guess one of your flagship
that's
guns,
and a premier big bore hunting gun.
Yeah, and I lusted after this gun for many years, and finally made it happen. And folks will note this integral barrel band, which you credit with the accuracy of these guns, right?
Well, I think so. I'm convinced that a barrel that gets tighter and tighter toward the muzzle is a good thing. My gun-making hero, Alexander Henry, thought so, and he spent a lot of time and treasure figuring out how to make tapered bores so that you would, especially his 400 caliber guns, they would start with a groove diameter, say of 412 or 413, whatever it was, and the groove diameter and the bore diameter somehow were tapered down to 3,000 or 4,000 smaller than that at the muzzle, and they were notoriously accurate. So while a choke at the rear end of the barrel is a killer of accuracy, it's just the death knell for good shooting. The tight choke at the front, it has quite the opposite effect. And if you know how button rifling is done, it's a pretty stressful operation. So when they pull this button through this rifle, this blank, it tends to spring back a little bit. Now, they say they try to stress relieve these barrels and all that kind of thing, but you don't notice it much until you get into a large diameter blank like 2 inches. And if you take a 2-inch diameter blank and turn a shank on the end of it that's 11/16 in the case of a Ruger, or 3/4 of an inch in the case of a Red Hawk, if you have pin gauges in half thousandths increments, that barrel shank will be sometimes at least 1,000th, maybe 1,000th and a half larger than the full diameter part of the rest of the barrel. So the Nimrod has enough of a band, and I don't have gauges good enough to measure it, but I'm convinced that the Nimrod barrel band tends to constrict the bore at the muzzle just a little bit. And it seems on balance, if I had to pick, conventional barrel form, like an octagonal barrel or just a plain round barrel, or the banded barrel will generally shoot better. And I'm not a trained engineer. I'm just flying with the seat of my pants here, but I'm convinced that's true.
Well, in my sample of one, it's the case. I mean, that gun shoots a lot better than I can hold it. So,
well, they do for me. I think the barrel's the trick there.
And mine's chambered in 45 Colt, but you of course offer it in several different options. And just to show folks kind of the other end of the spectrum of what you're willing and able to turn out, here's maybe the most impractical gun I own, which is a Ruger Red Hawk that you fit a Colt Anaconda 45 Colt barrel to. How'd you stumble on that as a
back in the dark ages of my career, there were still a lot of serious PPC gun builders working. The sport was pretty big amongst the law enforcement community. And one of the big tricks back then was to get the Python barrels, which were adjudged superior, I don't think for internal quality, but they had a much, much faster twist rate. So old-time pistolsmiths were screwing Colt barrels, Python barrels onto model 14 Smith & Wessons, and maybe some of the early Security 6 models, and they got better accuracy out of them. I just happened to think it looked cool, so I didn't really care that it shot necessarily better, but they looked nice. And it turns out that both the Python and Anaconda barrels are almost tailor-made for GP 100s and Red Hawks. So we just, when we could find them, we would buy them and fit them for people. And it's a distinctive look. It has no real-world benefit other than appearance.
Right. I wanted one because I wanted one. And you and I talked about this before, and probably the same reason some of the PPC guys were doing this. The the double action inner workings of a Colt are tremendously complicated and difficult to work on, whereas a Smith and a Ruger is a lot simpler.
Yeah, I was not trained to work on Colts, and I think to be really good at it, I'm convinced that you had to be a candidate at their armor school back in the day. And the only people I know today that do it probably were trained there, but there are not many left. But I'm totally at sea inside a Colt double action gun. I wouldn't touch one of those with a 10-foot pole. Compared to a Smith & Wesson action, it's just a Rube Goldberg assembly of gears and bells and whistles and stuff. And I just don't want to go there. I'm not that smart.
Right. So of all the things you've attempted, I really recommend folks go on your site and look at some of these things. We could talk about the book in a minute, but what do you think is the most ambitious project that you've ever completed from the maker's standpoint?
That's a good question. The number 5, the first number 5 would probably be pretty close to it. Ross's gun was certainly probably otherwise the technically most complicated thing that we have ever done. The only other guns that, in terms of difficulty, and this may be more time than difficulty, are the fixed sight Red Hawks. We built maybe a couple of dozen of those, but the one that really was a stretch for us was the 577 we built. That was just sort of just a test piece just to see if we could do it and make it work. And it worked great, but it required a special rifling head to get the barrel made the right diameter. We had to have cases made for it. There was just a lot of little nickel and dime technical stuff, little hurdles we had to overcome to get it done. But in the end, it worked great. And it was, I think, the first of the 1917 style Red Hawks we built.
And correct me if I'm wrong, didn't that require some type of NFA paperwork? Is it a destructive device or something like that because of this?
Considered a destructive device here 100 years after the fact.
Right.
State-of-the-art technology in 1880.
Probably a lot of 5.77 revolvers not getting picked up in crime scenes, but nonetheless. Yeah. So talk to me. I think you and I are both fans of as a lot of big revolver guys are, of the 45 Colt. What's kind of the magic of that cartridge when you put it in a big bore revolver?
I'll admit I'm not a ballistician, so I'm not the best guy to ask about that. But somehow it strikes a fine line between capacity and performance that the 44 Magnum can't quite get there. But for a lot of us, the 475s and 500s are just overkill. They're not easy for most people to shoot and manage well. But the 45 Colt, for whatever the reason, just happens to occupy a real sweet spot. You can shoot loads that are the moral equivalent of original black powder ammunition in them, or you can shoot stuff that's hard on the heels of the 454 at a little less pressure with a lot less recoil and racket. So it's just probably the single best all-around serious revolver cartridge I've ever seen.
And the 454 was built around lighter bullets, right? Pushed to fast speeds, whereas the 45 Colt can go a little bit heavier.
That was my impression. I didn't know Dick Casul very well and didn't really get to discuss this with him at great length. It's a wonderful cartridge. The problem, for me anyway, is it works at really, really high pressures, and I'm not convinced that anything except the Freedom Arms guns are really capable of taking a long, hard service life of that kind of ammunition. The Ruger Red Hawks will do pretty well, but they're double action guns, and between the receiver and the cylinder body, there are a dozen little intervening telescoping parts, don't have a lot of bearing area and contact area. So those guns can be worn out. I've seen 454 Red Hawks shot to the point where they're almost irreparable. The cylinders are worn out, and at the very minimum would have to be replaced so the guns can be retimed.
These are obviously really complicated projects we're talking about, but for the hobbyist out there, and you sell parts, some are gunsmith parts and some are kind of consumer installable parts.
Yes.
What are some easy upgrades that folks can make if they want to tinker with a let's say a Ruger revolver?
Well, for my money, the rear sight's by far the best accessory upgrade we could offer. It's just a lot hardier sights, a lot more flexible. We have a couple of different versions, one that has provision for interchangeable blades, and Ruger can't always guess or second guess the end users as to front sight height. So having a back sight that may let you compensate more easily for discrepancies in point of impact with a bunch of different loads is pretty handy. The old click adjustable target sights we make are not that flexible, but for people that don't really like to mess with opposing jam screw adjustments, that's probably the only alternative we would have.
Yeah, and I've got a double action Smith & Wesson 45 Colt that I started shooting heavier bullets in, and obviously the front sight was not set up for those, and I was about to set things up in my milling machine and create a whole front sight, and I went on your website and you had a rear sight that was tall enough to accommodate that different point of impact shift, and I was able to, with the turn of a screw, fix the situation instead of probably get myself into something that was over my head.
Oh yeah, the front sights are the tricky part. Most of us can interchange the rear or change the rear sight pretty easily. Occasionally you'll get a rogue gun that's got a weird set of specs, or a Mundy gun that had a elevator screw in the wrong place, and I've seen that before. And sometimes you've got to do some actual gunsmithing to get them to work properly.
What do you build the most of these days?
We're still building a fair number of Nimrods every year. Most of them, of course, are 45s, and we do a lot of old model 44 special caliber conversions. That gun conversion has been around since the 50s and still out there. There are a lot of guys just never warmed up to the new model guns, so we still do a lot of the old model 44s.
Honestly, we'll talk about the book now. I say this not because you're sitting here, but I think it is the definitive book on revolvers, and certainly custom revolvers. It's called The Custom Revolver. Our friend Ross wrote the foreword. It's a wonderful book. It's full of technical information. It's incredibly well written. The photos are wonderful. My understanding, I got one of the last hard copies that was found in your shop. My mother-in-law bought it for me for Christmas years ago. But it's available as an ebook on Amazon, $9.99, very affordable. But you're in the process of sort of retooling it for a second edition. Is that correct?
We're sure working at it. We've got the text is finished and edited relatively. We've had some updates that have come along the last couple of years, so I've got to integrate those into it. The writing is done. That was the easy part. The problem we're up against now is just I've got so many new guns to build, illustrate the developments and technologies come along in the last 25 years. So we're hoping against hope to have all those done this year, and the photography well along. So with a little luck, another couple of years, we should have the book back to press and available again.
Well, I'll be looking forward to it. But in the meantime, used copies are out there. They're, I think, $300 on Amazon, pretty pricey, but for $9.99 you can get the ebook and get all the information. Your website is also, as I mentioned, a treasure. I mean, I'll just go on there every once in a while and just poke around and learn something just about every time. You've also written plenty for magazines, and you did something that was I admired. Unfortunately, I guess it wasn't really as viable as you'd hoped, which was the Classic Arms Journal, which was a really great online publication.
I hated that didn't survive. We just never could get enough subscriptions to carry the cost of it. I think what will probably happen, unfortunately, we've lost Mike Venturino and Dusty Doster, two of the important contributors, so I don't know whether I could ever revive it again. What I've thought about doing instead of doing that is just trying to find a few friends who would like to toss out a piece or two a year and just publish in paper another, maybe as a quarterly, maybe just as an annual thing. We may try to do that again. That'd
be great. That'd be great. So you obviously, the canvas for you are factory handguns. If you could, tell the folks at Ruger or Smith & Wesson or Colt or whoever, if they said, we want you to spec out a gun for us to build, something you'd always wanted to see in a factory form, any idea what you'd ask for?
Well, that's hard to say. I don't even know where to start. True gun junkies lay awake at night and fevered thinking about things like that. And I've talked some with Ruger about the idea of a mid-frame 41 Magnum, and they've evidently done that now. So that would be one thing that I would have done. We've built any of a number of those over the last 25 years, and they're pretty cool guns. Just about as small and compact a gun with that level of horsepower that we could build on Ruger frames. if I was in charge at Ruger, just for the pure fun of it, I would love to see some sort of lightweight gun, whether titanium or scandium, in a single action. But that's probably a stretch. I don't know if that would be how technically feasible that would be. As to Smith & Wesson, they've got some wonderful platforms in the K&N frames that I'd love to see exploited some, and I'm hoping that'll happen. But the mountain gun is one of my favorite revolvers of all times, and I would like personally to see it with a square butt, just because my hands don't fit well the round butt grip frames. But there are all kinds of guns out there that it wouldn't be anything to spec out a whole bunch of cool stuff that they're not doing as a production model.
Right. And honestly, for folks who are interested in things like that, the Lipsy's limited guns are come pretty close to scratching a lot of those itches.
Yeah, they've got a great eye for that.
For sure. So this is a trio of questions that my plan is to ask everybody this. And first one is, what was your first gun?
Well, first air gun or real gun. I had a Sheridan rifle when I was a little bitty kid, and I think the first actual gun I had was a Model 24 Savage over and under 22 long rifle and 20 bore.
As practical as it gets.
Practical as it got here on the old home place.
Probably tough on rabbits and squirrels and things.
My grandmother was in residence here, and I was ordered to keep the garden free of rabbits and groundhogs, and did a pretty fair job of it.
Is there a kind of a holy grail gun that you've always sought after, and either you finally got it or you're not quite there yet? If there's the one gun you'd love to own?
Well, that's a really tough question. There are two or three.
It could be a couple too.
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 double barrel rifles I'd really love to have. I would love to have one of the underlever rising bite Rigby's in some caliber or other, the double rifle that they made back around the turn of the last century. And there is at least one Alexander Henry underlever hammerless screw grip single shot rifle out there that's sold at auction some years ago. Those are right off the top of my head, probably the 2 guns that I would covet as much as anything.
And those choices are well reflected in your in the style of your builds. You can see elements of that in a lot of your guns.
It didn't hurt us any.
Right. If you're going to emulate something, those are a pretty good place to start. Is there a gun that got away that you've owned, that you sold or traded, and you wish you had back?
Probably the little Savage.
Okay.
I hated back then. Guns were guns, and they just came and went, and we traded up as best we could. But that was one I wish I had back. I really do. I didn't have sense enough as a kid or as a teenager when I got rid of it to keep it.
My story is exactly the same. Probably the only gun I ever got rid of that I'd love to have back was a cheap, Smith & Wesson 422. It's was a cheap gun, is a cheap gun now, but I wish I had mine back, and I sold it for just a little bit of money. So that was wonderful. Hamilton, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's an honor to be here, Keith. I really appreciate being on.
So the Custom Revolver, it's available on Amazon as an ebook. It's available in used format, and if you got the coin, and BowenClassicArms.com is a really, really interesting website to check out. I recommend for everybody, and we just appreciate you being here. Thanks.
Well, my pleasure.